Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we're talking about various aspects of the book publishing industry and why audiobooks are the new frontier for self-published authors. Jane Friedman has spent almost the entirety of her professional career working in book publishing. In the mid-aughts, she began writing about the industry, both for professional outlets and her own blog. A few years ago, she launched a paid newsletter that now generates the majority of her income. I recently interviewed Friedman about her work. We discussed how she grew her newsletter into a sustainable business, and then we talked about the current state of book publishing. One aspect of this world that's long fascinated me is self-publishing, so I asked Friedman to fill me in on how this market is maturing and where self-published writers are seeing success. Let's jump right into it. Hey Jane, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Simon.
So you run a successful paid newsletter focused on the publishing industry. How did you first get interested in the goings-on in the publishing industry in the first place?
I've been working in book publishing since the mid-90s, and it's the only business I have ever worked in. So it was a very natural fit to be writing and reporting on book publishing specifically, although, of course, book publishing gets affected by all sorts of digital media these days.
So when you say you were working, you were on the publisher side?
I worked in traditional publishing, both books and magazines, but mostly books.
And how did you first decide to start writing about the publishing industry?
Well, the roots of that are somewhat in the company I worked for, a company called F&W Media, an enthusiast publisher, which unfortunately went bankrupt earlier this year. That's another story. And that company was the owner of Writer's Digest. So I worked for that particular brand, among some others that the company owned. And of course, Writer's Digest focuses on serving an audience of writers. And so a lot of the work that I did there was writing and reporting on industry issues that affect writers. And then I would say about 10 years after I joined the company, there was interest in producing an industry-focused event, which came to be known as Digital Book World, similar to a Tools of Change O'Reilly conference that was going on at the time, but no longer exists. It mainly focused on helping book publishers do better with the digital changes in the media.
But you originally, or you eventually started moving on from writing for Writer's Digest to writing for your own blog and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, while I was still employed, in fact, I started doing some stuff on my own because I knew that I was not going to stay at this company forever and I needed to lay the foundation for another life, probably a freelance life.
And what was what were you writing about? It seems like there are a lot of people who aspire to be writers, and the publishing industry is considered to be this kind of opaque industry, and there's lots of myths about how to get discovered, and it's not like an industry that's very open about what's the way to break into
Right.
it. So was that kind of what your writing was kind of geared towards, kind of opening up that kind of mystifying world that for a lot of people?
Yes, and mainly focused on definitely the business side. There are many sites and blogs out there that talk about craft and technique and being a better artist, and also the psychological aspects of the business. And I have very little interest in all of that. I'm really just focused on the numbers, the financials, really interested in how people make money at this, both whether you're the publisher or the author, and how the business models keep changing, which of course this affects writers across all industries. It's not just book publishing, it's also magazine and newspaper publishing, as you know.
So what would that entail? So giving people advice on how to find an agent, how to negotiate in advance, how to think about in advance in terms of, what are some of the things that you would think you would kind of write advice about?
Yeah, precisely what you just mentioned. Literary agents, how publishers evaluate materials, how they put together profit and loss statements, and how that affects their decision on what books to publish, how editors and agents think about products to be sold in the market. I also, in a other publication that I founded, which doesn't exist, I did a contract series. So my goal has always been to help authors be much more independent in their thinking about how this business is going to run for them, rather than relying on, say, their agent or their publisher to kind of handhold them, which often nobody gets that sort of hand-holding. Every year you'll see an article come out from a writer who's had a book or two out saying, I thought I was set for life. I thought my $300,000 advance was going to last longer than it did. But then I realized my books
And
weren't.
was a harbinger of future advances and stuff like
Exactly.
that, right? Yeah.
Right. But then there weren't any royalties and they stopped offering me the big bucks. So, like, you see these wake up call articles, and I'm always trying to help people avoid those nasty realizations when it's too late to do something.
And approximately when did you start writing your own content on like your own blog?
I started in 2008 writing for my employer, and then I started writing on my own turf at the same time about a year later. And so I eventually left my employer about a couple years after that blog started for them. And I continued doing it, but realized I had to kind of rip off the Band-Aid, stop writing for them, and start doing it all on my own website. And so that transition happened in 2011.
And this is all happening when things were getting really interested in the publishing industry, right?
Yeah.
Because I used to be I don't want to be a fiction writer anymore, but I used to want to be a fiction writer, and I was getting really into all this kind of stuff in like the early to mid 2000s, when self-publishing was called vanity
Hmm.
publishing, and you, in order to self-publish, you were either doing print on demand, or you had to basically order you would have to order large bulks of your own books and try to convince stores
Yes.
to hold them. And there were ebooks, but ebooks was just like, it was like less than 1% of the
Yeah.
market. It was just so tiny. And then, Amazon invents the Kindle, and it was just such a game changer in terms of, one, ebooks became like a real market with that took up a larger and larger pie, but you started to seeing a lot more success cases um, within the self-publishing sphere. Obviously, there are still tensions between traditional authors and self-publishing, but
Mhm.
self-publishing got a little bit more legitimacy. So, was this like a really exciting time to be writing about the publishing industry, because it was seeing kind of changes it hadn't really seen in decades?
Oh yeah, very rich time. I would argue it's still a very rich time because changes have never really stopped occurring since that time period you referenced. Like that 2010 to 2012 period was just like the gold rush time. Maybe even stretched to 2014 roughly, and people were saying, "Oh, traditional publishing is dead," and it was heady.
Yeah.
So it was.
And probably a lot of snake oils too that you have to try to
Oh
steer
yeah.
people away from, right?
Yeah, although in all honesty, the snake oil people have been there for, gosh, 100 years or more. The vanity publishers and the people who take advantage are always there. But it's interesting. I had in the very earliest parts of my career, I was put on the self-publishing beat, so I was very knowledgeable about kind of the old legacy style of self-publishing, where it had all of this investment that you had to make, and it really was a stigma surrounding it. And so to see it so transform was just amazing.
And so, but a lot of your content was free. Eventually, you launched a paid newsletter. Walk me through the decision process you went through before launching that.
Yeah, so there was a failure before the current paid newsletter got up and running. So the current newsletter I run, it's called the Hot Sheet. It launched in 2015 with a business partner. It's just mine at this point, but we started it together 4 years ago. But prior to that, this was in around 2013, 2014, I was working for a literary journal, and things were not going that well. And I realized I wanted to just go do something on my own. And I started doing it while I was still employed, always kind of a tricky proposition. Um, and it was a magazine called Scratch. And I wanted to have this as a new revenue stream and something that could help me break away from traditional employment. And so for that publication, we had an iOS app and a website that was all done by a third party. But when those third parties went belly up, so did the publication. So that it didn't last very long, about 2 years max.
And so, what was your thinking with this newsletter? Like, how would it what would how would it be designed in terms of like what would go into it? Like, how did you kind of decide what the value proposition would be for people to pay for it?
Well, I realized from some past mistakes that first, I needed to focus on the market that was willing to pay more. And so the prior publication, it was a very low price point, and it just wasn't enough money to really make a sustainable go of it. I mean, we were in the black on that first publication, but it was just not enough money to make it compelling as a business model. And so right away I knew that if I was going to charge a higher price, I needed to be targeting a more advanced professional audience who would see the value in what I was providing. And I knew that my information stood out, even the free stuff stood out for its advanced look at the industry. And then I had a better grasp of what was going on in the industry because of my 20 years of watching it unfold than most other bloggers and commentators. I just had the context and I understood kind of the 360-degree viewpoints of all of the players and how they fell out on the landscape, whether they were more pro-independent self-publishing or pro-traditional. And so that's the value that I felt that I brought to this newsletter. And yeah, so that was the market play.
And what do you charge for it?
I charge $59 a year, although there are discounts that a lot of member writers organizations have. So if you're a member of one of these organizations, you can get 20 or 30% off.
And when did you launch it?
This was launched in the beta was launched in August 2015, and then our first paid issues started going out in late September.
So this was before the current kind of crop of startups that have really kind of brought together a lot of these, these tools under one roof. Where you probably had to cobble together a couple different solutions in order to make that possible.
Yes. And, even if a solution like Substack, for instance, had been available, I'm not sure I would have used it. And it's because of the failure I had with that Scratch publication where the providers we were relying on, they were gone within a couple years. And I thought, I do not want to find myself in that position again. And so I use a combination of MailChimp, which I hope isn't going anywhere, and ChargeBee, which is a startup, but so far it's proven pretty reliable. And I feel like the data, most importantly, the subscriber data that's in that system, I could export and take somewhere else if I had to.
And so how successful has it been? It has been the paid newsletter in terms of it becoming like a real portion of your income?
It's very meaningful. So roughly $50,000 to $60,000 net every year at this point. So definitely a living for one person. I keep the costs very low. I managed to get into ChargeBee back when it was priced extremely affordably, and I'm still on that legacy plan. And the subscribership to the hot sheet is around 1,200 people, which means I'm also on a pretty low-priced MailChimp plan as well.
And if you like had a pie chart of who those people are, like how many are, or what percentage is like aspiring writers who are trying to break into the industry versus established professional writers versus people who work on the publishing side?
I would say it's probably 70 to 80% professional authors who are really serious about making a living from their writing, and very few aspiring, because those people quickly fall off when they realize this is just above their head or it's not really applicable to their immediate goals. And then there is probably 10 to 20% of either others in the industry, agents, people in traditional publishing, or service providers, people who are focused on the author community.
And what do I get if I subscribe? Like, how many issues and how packed are they with content?
It's every 2 weeks, delivered on a Wednesday about lunchtime, and it's 5 editorial items, which usually are about 1,000 words each, sometimes a little longer, it depends. And then there's, at the end, a links of interest, which is basically all of the stuff that writers should probably be aware of, trends, news, marketing information that's been reported elsewhere, but that I don't see a need to be reporting on more in depth. So that's the whole of it. And it's probably a good 30-minute read if you were to read it from beginning to end.
So you don't produce a lot of free content anymore, right?
I still do a lot of content on my blog. So this would be at janefriedman.com. But the truth is, a lot of it is guest content at this point. I'm not actively writing for free for my blog unless there's just often, unless it's promoting hot sheet content. So almost all of the original writing that I do is for hot sheet, or it's I'm doing it freelance for Publishers Weekly or Writer's Digest.
So that kind of differs from how a lot of these newsletter writers are approaching it, where they're putting out a certain number of free newsletters per week and then trying to use that as lead gen for the paid newsletter. How would you say most of your marketing for this paid newsletter goes?
I do have a free newsletter that I've had for many years now, like going back to 2007, 2008. It's called Electric Speed. It also goes out every 2 weeks. It's about 32,000 people. And so that does have a huge audience of aspiring writers and all sorts of people who are just interested in my digital tool recommendations. That's mostly what it consists of. So there's a promotion for Electric Speed at the end of every Electric Speed issue. Or did I say that right? There's a promotion for Hot Sheet, yeah, at the end of every Electric Speed issue. And then also on my website and some other materials that I send out, I do mention Hot Sheet. But by and large, that's about the only marketing I do aside from those partnerships with authors' organizations.
But you're also kind of like a sought after thought leader, right? In terms of being interviewed or doing speaking engagements and stuff like that. Do you use that as an opportunity to promote the newsletter?
100%. So I do speak at about 15 to 20 events per year. And so every time I'm out on the road speaking, I mention Hot Sheet. I offer people in the audience a discount to subscribe within the next few days. So that does contribute and spread the word as well.
So let's dive into some of your your recent coverage, and I am really interested in this kind of self-publishing industry that's really kind of grown over the last 10 years or so. Can you give me a sense of how big it is? Do we know? Are there studies out there to like what kind of market this is?
Everyone would love specific figures, but the only entity in a position to say something meaningful is probably Amazon. The second organization that's been able to quantify it, aside from Amazon's little mysterious figures that they sometimes release, is Bowker, which is the agency that issues ISBN numbers. So ISBNs are the identifying numbers that go on every published book. And so the last time Bowker released some stats, it was like more than 1 million ISBNs for books within the space of a year. But the catch here is that if you publish an ebook on Amazon, it doesn't need an ISBN. So there's this, it's what people call the shadow publishing that's going on beneath the surface that really only Amazon knows about. But that said, if the self-publishing author is pretty serious and they're trying to distribute widely through all channels, then they probably are going to have an ISBN. And we do know the size of that market, and it's enormous.
Do we think it's above like $1 billion a year in sales?
I would be surprised if it were 1 billion. I know that Michael Cater, who is one of the biggest industry experts for book publishing, he runs a newsletter called Publishing Lunch. And about 1.5 years ago, he did some crunching of the numbers, trying to use all of the data points we have from various sources to give us a sense. And he estimated that 80% of the market is traditional and 20% is self-publishing. But unfortunately, I don't remember the dollar figures he cited, but I don't think it reached 1 million or 1 billion.
There's also kind of debate over how big the ebook market is, because a lot of the numbers are put out are from the Association for Professional Publishers, and they're only really counting sales of ebooks that are produced by like the major publishers and not really counting self-publishing. I know there's this guy who does like a monthly roundup of what's going on in terms of self-publishing ebooks or ebook sales or something like that. I forget what his name is, but he gets cited a lot. You probably know him. And he seems to suggest that because these numbers that are put out by the publishing industry seem to be indicating that the ebook market is stalling, but he kind of suggests that that's because once they were able to price their own ebooks, they raised the prices, and they artificially stalled the growth of the ebook market for traditional publishing,
Mhm.
but that the self-publishing side is still growing very quickly. And so that's why it's hard to figure out what the numbers are actually are,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I think you're thinking of the author earnings guy,
Yeah.
and he stopped doing those reports maybe a year and a half ago for various reasons I won't go into. But he was right about a lot of things, and I think his work has been important in identifying this shadow industry. Um, but I also think that his numbers were extrapolations from Amazon rankings, and so there was a lot of fuzzy math involved. Um, but I couldn't agree more that the official stats that you see coming out from the AAP and other organizations, they're very distorting, and they only look at what traditional publishers report. There is no way to get a real handle on what self-publishers are earning, aside from, again, some of the little hints that Amazon drops about how many authors earn above a certain level in a year.
So as I kind of mentioned before, 15 years ago, self-publishing was just, I mean, it was considered vanity publishing. It was everybody looked down on it. Knowing what you know now, how do you kind of view self-publishing? Like if you were giving advice to, a newer writer who's, written a novel or two today, how would you advise them to navigate the publishing industry right now? Would you tell them to go straight to trying to get an agent and trying to break into the big publishers, the big four, big five, or whatever it is? Or are there scenarios where you'd say, hey, maybe that isn't the right path?
I think the best thing that's happened is that there's no one way to get the job done anymore. There are multiple ways to be an author and succeed. The self-publishing market has become extremely competitive. So it is not the 2010, 2012 era anymore, and the market is flooded. And it's because of the way that Amazon has changed. For instance, it's really hard to get your book noticed there unless you're advertising on Amazon. Um, it's not something I would recommend people default to self-publishing because they've heard, all of these things about keeping your rights or keeping control or being entrepreneurial. It is hard. It is just as hard, I think, as getting a traditional publisher and succeeding that way. So you have to evaluate the project itself, where it's most likely to succeed, if it's really something that does well in ebook format, what sort of success you're looking for, and then weigh the pros and cons. This is why I do every year a key publishing paths chart, which kind of sets out the pros and cons of the various options that are out there now, so people can think through with some sort of like checklist which path is best for them. I will say that self-publishing tends to favor very commercial fiction, series fiction, romance fiction, anything that people are consuming in really large quantities, where you can compete on price. Because as you mentioned earlier, traditional publishers are pricing their ebooks, at above $10 often, and so self-publishers compete well when they can undercut that pricing.
Yeah, and to kind of back up what you're saying about, the amount of work, but then also the kind of fiction that succeeds, is I did a big article a few years ago about authors who write zombie fiction, and every single one of them that I interviewed to a T is they would say, I will spend 3 months and write 6 books in a row,
Yeah.
and then I will release the first one for free.
Yep.
So that first one is just merely a marketing vehicle, because a lot of people, they don't like to sample a series unless they can read the first book for free. And then they just progressively charge more and more,
Yep.
because I guess their thinking is the more invested the person is in the series, the more they're willing to pay. So the second book in the series might be $1, the third book might be $2, and so on. And so, but they don't even release the first book until they've written all 6, because
Mhm.
I guess the view is that it's kind of like the Netflix model of allowing binging. You have to put this entire series in front of the person, so that if they're going to invest in it, they know that they can keep on reading.
Yes, yes, that is the model that you see most prevalent, and part of this has been a result of Amazon itself, which tends to reward seeing steady sales across across your title or titles. It's harder to keep those sales consistent and to keep them going at the kind of level you need for visibility if you don't have more than one book. So yeah, that quick release schedule has become a curse for some authors who are having trouble keeping up that kind of pace.
One thing you've written about, and something I didn't know about, is that there's a new frontier that's opening in self-publishing, and it's going beyond ebooks and into audiobooks. Why is this happening?
Well, digital audio is the biggest growth area in publishing, at least for traditional publishers right now. I'm sure, if you're paying attention to the headlines, you'll see talk about 20 and 30% growth year on year. And these things are selling at high prices. And it's so far there's no signs that the growth is stopping, and publishers are starting to get into really complicated multiple narrator, full cast recording editions of their audiobooks. And so of course this affects self-publishers too. There's a big rush into audio. And what's been so interesting about the change recently is that you're seeing some of the innovation in digital audio come from places that aren't Amazon or Audible, and a lot more flexibility on pricing and offering these lead magnets. Like you mentioned earlier, people will offer the first in a series for free in order to get people in the door and then charge them for the second book, and so on. It's been really hard to do that in audio because that lead magnet system hasn't been established, at least not in the Audible environment. So what we're seeing are other distributors like Findaway Voices and BookBub's Chirp doing things that are more innovative. And so indie authors are looking now to these other places that aren't Amazon in order to get some lift off on their audiobook editions. And I haven't even mentioned like the library market, which is like it's a whole other interesting thing that's going on with both ebooks and with audio. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out, because Audible, of course, right now is kind of in a legal battle over its own recent innovation of the captioning feature. And I'm curious to see how they're going to respond to the more control and flexibility that other distributors are now offering the self-published authors.
And Audible like really dominates the audiobook industry, even more so than Amazon dominates the print book industry, right? Like it has pretty much a lock on it, right? And it bought that a long time ago before smartphones even existed. It was kind of very prescient that they figured out that they needed to buy into this market, because audiobooks used to be pretty a small percentage of the market, right? Because they were these clunky CDs that you had to, get from the library or buy for like $50 per book or something like that. So Amazon was really early in the game, and then they caught the smartphone market, just at the right time when people were starting to listen to stuff on their phones.
Yes, very prescient. And they do still have a huge piece of the market. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's got to be 70 to 80%, although people see it changing. So yeah, it's something I've got my eye on.
But what are self-publishers doing? Because like, it seems like there's some expensive production costs that would be involved, much more so than publishing an ebook. How are they overcoming these challenges?
Well, to date, I think often what they've done is use ACX, which is the offshoot of Audible that allows authors or publishers to enter a marketplace where they find narrators. And so when you find your narrator through ACX, you can choose a royalty share, which means you don't have to pay that upfront cost. The huge drawback is that if you do that, you are committing to an exclusivity agreement with Audible for 7 years, which is kind of crazy in the current environment. I mean, if we just go back 7 years in the ebook market, it's entirely different. So imagine what the audiobook market might look like in 7 years. And it's starting to pose some really interesting strategic questions for authors who, they may not want to invest in this high upfront cost. It's usually $5,000, could be more depending on the length of the book. But it's probably worth it in the long run to make that investment and then to reap the rewards over a longer period of time by having wide distribution, given the number of opportunities that are opening up.
And what are some of these startups doing in the space? Like, are they just other marketplace apps that you download and it's just easier for self-published authors to list their books there? Or what are they doing?
So Findaway Voices is one of the, I would say, the most well-known companies at the moment for authors because they help you with both the production of the audiobook if you wish, and then they also do the distribution piece, meaning that they push your audiobook out to everyone who sells audiobooks, including Apple, Google, and libraries. And they also, of course, can send your book out to Audible. So I think authors are looking at how Findaway allows them to control their price, which Audible does not. It's a very important distinction there because Audible basically sets it at whatever they want, and then you just live with the results. Findaway doesn't require that, meaning you can price lower, especially if you're a self-published author. As I said, pricing is your one competitive differentiator. And then there's also going to be new features where you can make a larger sample available for free. So like the first few hours, for example, which just isn't possible right now through Audible. BookBub's Chirp is the other interesting entrant. I think they first went onto the market about a year ago. And so if you're familiar at all with BookBub on the ebook side, you know that they offer these featured deals and they're really cheap. So the BookBub Chirp is a similar model, but it's audiobooks and they're selling directly, which is different from the ebook side. So in any event, those two plus Kobo, another ebook retailer, is now also starting to sell audio directly. So that, yeah, a lot of activity.
Yeah, it seems like it wouldn't be too hard to. I mean, there are tons of podcast apps on the market. Doesn't seem like it would be too hard to launch an app where there's some kind of just be able way to upload an audio file and then charge money for it. It's just about scale and getting people onto that app and stuff like that.
Yep.
Okay, Jane. Well, those were all the questions I had. Where can people find you online?
You can find me at janefriedman.com, and then my newsletter, The Hot Sheet, is at hotsheetpub.com.
Awesome. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.